The year was 1938, and American farming stood at a crossroads nobody saw coming. While John Deere and International Harvester were busy perfecting the traditional tractor, open-air machines that left farmers sunburned in summer and frostbitten in winter, one company decided to throw the rulebook into a ditch and build something audacious, something ridiculous, something that would either revolutionize agriculture or become the most spectacular failure the industry had ever seen. Minneapolis-Moline, the smallest of the major tractor manufacturers, was about to roll out a machine so radical that farmers, dealers, and competitors alike would stop dead in their tracks. They called it the UDLX Comfort Tractor. History would remember it differently. It became the Edsel before Edsel existed, a cautionary tale of what happens when brilliant engineering collides head-on with market reality. But here's the thing about spectacular failures. They're rarely as simple as bad idea poorly executed. The UDLX was actually a good idea, a great idea even. It was a luxury automobile grafted onto a working tractor. Enclosed cab, heater, radio, plush upholstered seats, windshield wipers, a top speed of 40 miles per hour on the highway. It could plow your fields all day, then take your family into town for dinner and a movie that same evening. One machine, two lives, farm implement by day, passenger car by night. The concept was so forward-thinking that it wouldn't become standard practice for another 40 years. Today, every serious agricultural tractor has an enclosed climate-controlled cab. Farmers expect air conditioning, stereo systems, GPS navigation, and suspension seats as standard equipment. The UDLX offered all of this in 1938 when most tractors didn't even have fenders. So what went wrong? How did a machine this innovative become a punchline? The answer involves Depression-era economics, cultural resistance, corporate desperation, and a fundamental misreading of what farmers actually wanted versus what they needed. It's a story about timing, pride, and the dangerous space between vision and pragmatism. To understand the UDLX, you first need to understand Minneapolis-Moline itself. The company was born from merger fever in 1929 when three separate agricultural equipment manufacturers, Minneapolis Steel Machinery, Minneapolis Threshing Machine, and Moline Plow Company, combined forces to compete against the industry giants. The timing couldn't have been worse. They consolidated just months before the stock market crash that triggered the Great Depression. While other manufacturers had decades of brand loyalty and dealer networks, Minneapolis-Moline was starting from scratch during the worst economic catastrophe in American history. Farmers were losing their land, banks were failing, equipment sales were collapsing. The new company needed something dramatic to grab attention and establish credibility. They needed to stand out. Their initial strategy was solid. Build reliable, powerful tractors painted in distinctive prairie gold with red wheels. The color scheme alone made Minneapolis-Moline tractors instantly recognizable across any field. Their Model U, introduced in 1938 as the agricultural tractor cousin to the UDLX, was genuinely excellent. It featured a high-compression engine, producing 38 horsepower at the belt and 30 horsepower at the drawbar. Strong numbers for the era. The U model could pull three 14-inch plow bottoms through heavy soil without laboring. But excellent wasn't enough. International Harvester and John Deere had excellent too, plus history and loyalty and massive dealer networks. Minneapolis-Moline needed something nobody else had. They needed revolutionary. The man behind the UDLX concept was a Minneapolis-Moline executive who understood that American farming was changing fundamentally. Rural electrification was spreading across the countryside. Improved roads were connecting farms to towns. Radio was bringing news and entertainment to isolated homesteads. The younger generation of farmers, those who would inherit these operations, had grown up with automobiles. They expected comfort. They wanted modernity. More importantly, there was a practical problem on every farm in America: equipment redundancy. A farmer needed a tractor for fieldwork. He also needed a car or truck for transportation. That meant buying, maintaining, and storing two separate vehicles. For struggling Depression-era farmers, that duplication represented significant wasted capital. What if one machine could do both jobs? What if you could drive your tractor to town without looking like a rube? What if farming could finally shed its image as backward and primitive? The UDLX was Minneapolis-Moline's answer to all these questions. The engineering team started with the Model U agricultural tractor as the foundation. They kept the powerful 4-cylinder engine, the 5-speed transmission, and the robust rear axle housing. Then they built something entirely new around it. First came the fully enclosed cab, constructed from stamped steel panels. This wasn't a flimsy aftermarket addition, it was integral to the machine's design, mounted directly to the frame. The cab featured roll-up windows, a proper windshield with vacuum-powered wipers, and a sliding rear window for ventilation. The door latched securely with an automotive-style handle. Inside, the UDLX provided comfort that would have embarrassed most cars of the period. 2 upholstered seats, proper seats with springs and padding, not the cast-iron pan that passed for seating on other tractors. The operator seat was adjustable fore and aft. The passenger seat folded down to accommodate a third person if needed, making this genuinely a family vehicle. The dashboard was pure 1930s automotive styling, a painted metal panel housing the speedometer, tachometer, ammeter, oil pressure gauge, and water temperature gauge. Everything a driver needed laid out logically. Toggle switches controlled the lights. Yes, this tractor had proper electrical lighting front and rear, powered by a generator. No more fumbling with oil lamps during early morning or late evening work. But the real luxury? The heater. The UDLX featured a water-heated system that pulled warmth from the engine coolant. For farmers accustomed to bundling up in multiple layers and still shivering through winter fieldwork, this was transformative. You could operate this machine in January wearing normal clothes. And then there was the radio, a genuine AM radio installed in the dashboard, pulling in stations up to 50 miles away. Farmers could listen to crop reports, weather forecasts, news, and music while they worked. This single feature represented a radical reimagining of what agricultural work could be. The engineering aspects were equally impressive. Minneapolis-Moline knew that highway travel required more than just a cab. They equipped the UDLX with automotive-style brakes on all 4 wheels. 2-wheel brakes were standard on tractors at the time, and a more sophisticated clutch designed for frequent engagement during road driving. The transmission offered a high-range gear set specifically for road speeds, allowing the UDLX to cruise comfortably at 40 miles per hour. Rubber tires were standard equipment, not optional. The rear axle had a novel design. The wheel treads were adjustable to match different row spacings for fieldwork, but could be narrowed for highway travel, reducing the machine's overall width to less than 8 feet. This allowed the UDLX to legally operate on most roads without special permits. Even the styling received attention. The hood featured streamlined curves and chrome details. The grille was vertical and dignified, almost elegant. The prairie gold paint was accented with red pinstriping and chrome details. This wasn't just a tractor with a cab bolted on. This was a designed object intended to look good parked in town. Minneapolis-Moline was incredibly proud of what they'd created. They priced the UDLX at $2,155, which seems reasonable until you realize that a standard Model U tractor, mechanically identical underneath all that luxury, sold for $1,095. The Comfort tractor cost nearly double the base agricultural model. To put that into perspective, a new 1938 Ford Standard 2-door sedan cost $770. A Chevrolet Master Deluxe Business Coupe was $815. A farmer could buy a new car and a standard tractor and still spend less than one UDLX would cost him. But Minneapolis-Moline believed they had something special. They believed farmers would see the value. They believed the future of agriculture was comfort, efficiency, and modernization. They ramped up production and prepared for success. They believed wrong.
The first UDLX rolled off the Minneapolis-Moline production line in early 1938, and the company immediately began a marketing campaign that positioned it as the future of farming. Full-page advertisements appeared in agricultural magazines, showing well-dressed farmers driving the Comfort tractor down tree-lined roads, their families smiling beside them. The copy emphasized comfort, modernity, and efficiency. Why shouldn't farming be as pleasant as any other business? One advertisement asked. Dealers were enthusiastic initially. The UDLX generated attention wherever it appeared. Farmers would stop and stare. They'd climb into the cab, sit in those upholstered seats, turn the steering wheel, and marvel at the dashboard. It was unlike anything they had ever seen. Minneapolis-Moline staged demonstrations where operators would plow a field, then drive directly to town at highway speeds, park on Main Street, and step out looking fresh and comfortable. The demonstrations were effective theater. But theater doesn't sell tractors. Reality sells tractors, and the reality of the UDLX collided with several immovable obstacles that Minneapolis-Moline had failed to consider adequately. The first problem was purely economic. In 1938, American agriculture was still struggling through the Depression. Farm income had improved slightly from the catastrophic lows of 1932 and 33, but most farmers were still operating on razor-thin margins. Equipment purchases were carefully calculated investments, not luxury indulgences. Spending an extra $1,000 for a cab and amenities was simply impossible for the majority of operations. The farmers who could afford luxury, the large-scale operators with thousands of acres and hired help, weren't the ones sitting on tractors all day. They had employees for that. The farmers who sat on tractors daily, the small and medium operators, couldn't justify the expense. The UDLX fell into a painful economic gap, too expensive for those who needed it, unnecessary for those who could afford it. The second problem was cultural. American farmers in the 1930s were proud of their toughness. Farming was hard work, performed in harsh conditions, and that hardship was worn as a badge of honor. A man who needed a heated cab and a radio to plow his fields, that wasn't a real farmer. That was soft, effeminate even. The sneering term comfort tractor was used mockingly by critics who saw the UDLX as evidence of declining standards and weakening character. This cultural resistance was particularly strong among older farmers who had grown up working behind horse-drawn equipment in all-weather conditions. To them, the UDLX represented everything wrong with the younger generation, an obsession with comfort and convenience at the expense of work ethic. When a young farmer expressed interest in buying a UDLX, his father often shut down the conversation immediately. Rural masculinity in the 1930s was defined by endurance. You proved yourself through suffering. A tractor with amenities undermined that entire value system. It suggested that comfort mattered more than character. For many farmers, that was unacceptable. The third problem was mechanical skepticism. The UDLX was complex. All those automotive features, the windows, the heater, the radio, the multi-wheel brakes, represented additional maintenance requirements and potential failure points. Farmers valued simplicity and reliability above all else. A machine that broke down during harvest season could destroy a year's income. The simpler the machine, the easier it was to repair in the field with basic tools. The UDLX wasn't simple. If the vacuum system for the windshield wipers failed, that required specific knowledge to fix. If the radio quit working, most farmers had no idea how to troubleshoot it. If the heater developed a leak, that coolant leak could affect engine performance. Every luxury feature was also a potential liability. Moreover, the enclosed cab created maintenance headaches that open tractors didn't face. Oil leaks and engine problems that would be immediately visible on an open machine were hidden inside the cab, potentially causing serious damage before they were discovered. The engine access required removing panels, which took time. Farmers who were accustomed to simply popping a hood and reaching directly to the engine found the UDLX frustrating to service. The fourth problem was practical functionality. Despite all the engineering effort, the UDLX wasn't quite good enough at either job it attempted to perform. As a field tractor, the cab created blind spots that made close work difficult. The operator couldn't easily look down and behind to monitor implements. The enclosed space made it harder to hear the engine and transmission, which farmers relied on to detect problems early. And while the cab kept weather out, it also trapped heat during summer. The ventilation system helped, but working in a hot cab all day was miserable. As a road vehicle, the UDLX had its own limitations. 40 miles per hour was impressive for a tractor, but it was painfully slow compared to actual automobiles which could cruise comfortably at 60. The ride quality, despite the upholstered seats, was harsh due to the stiff agricultural suspension and solid rear axle. The braking system, though better than agricultural standards, wasn't as refined as automotive brakes, and the visibility from the cab, while acceptable for field work, wasn't as good as a proper automobile. Farmers quickly realized they weren't getting the best of both worlds. They were getting something that was mediocre at two different jobs rather than excellent at one. For the same money, they could buy a great tractor and a decent used car, giving them vehicles that each excelled at their specific purpose. The fifth problem was dealer reluctance. Minneapolis-Moline dealers were accustomed to selling agricultural equipment to farmers. They knew how to demonstrate plow performance, discuss drawbar horsepower, and explain gear ratios. They didn't know how to sell automotive luxury. They weren't comfortable discussing heater systems and radios. Many dealers actively discouraged farmers from buying the UDLX, steering them instead toward the standard Model U, which had a proven track record and fewer potential service headaches. Some dealers refused to stock the UDLX at all, viewing it as an expensive distraction that tied up capital and floor space. Without strong dealer support, the machine had no chance of reaching its target market effectively. Production figures tell the story clearly. Minneapolis-Moline manufactured 150 UDLX comfort tractors in 1938. They sold fewer than half that number during the first year. By the end of 1939, they had sold most of the remaining inventory, but many of those sales were at significant discounts as the company tried desperately to move unsold units. In total, between 1938 and 1941, Minneapolis-Moline produced only 150 UDLX tractors. Some sources claim the number was actually closer to 125. The exact figure is disputed because Minneapolis-Moline was not eager to document this particular failure. Either way, the production run was catastrophically short for a machine that required significant tooling investment and engineering development. For context, Minneapolis-Moline produced over 35,000 standard Model U tractors during the same period. The agricultural tractor was a success. The comfort tractor was a disaster. The company's response to poor sales was to make things worse. In 1939, they introduced a modified version called the UDLX Standard, which stripped out some of the luxury features in an attempt to reduce the price. This version eliminated the radio and some chrome trim, but kept the enclosed cab and basic amenities. The price dropped to around $1,800, which was better but still far too expensive. The UDLX Standard failed just as thoroughly as the original. The farmers who couldn't afford $2,155 couldn't afford $1,800 either. And the farmers who might have been willing to pay for luxury didn't want the stripped-down version. Minneapolis-Moline had managed to alienate both potential customer segments simultaneously. By 1940, the writing was on the wall. The UDLX was dead. Minneapolis-Moline quietly discontinued production and tried to pretend the entire episode had never happened. Internal company documents from the period are scarce. Most were likely destroyed to avoid preserving evidence of this expensive failure. The financial impact on Minneapolis-Moline was substantial. The company had invested heavily in developing the UDLX, including engineering costs, tooling, marketing, and production capacity. The return on that investment was abysmal. While the company survived, helped significantly by the success of the standard Model U and their other agricultural products, the UDLX fiasco damaged Minneapolis-Moline's reputation and consumed resources that could have been used more productively. More importantly, the failure made the company gun-shy about innovation. For years afterwards, Minneapolis-Moline was reluctant to deviate from conservative, proven designs. They continued building quality tractors, but the bold risk-taking that had characterized their early years was gone. The UDLX had taught them a painful lesson about the dangers of being too far ahead of the market.
The UDLX failure would have been merely a financial loss if it had simply disappeared into history. Instead, it became something more interesting, a case study in why brilliant engineering doesn't guarantee market success. And decades later, when the agricultural industry finally embraced everything the UDLX had offered, the machine's reputation shifted from failure to prophecy. But that vindication was still decades away. In 1940, the UDLX was just an expensive mistake that Minneapolis-Moline wanted to forget. The company refocused on conventional tractors and tried to rebuild their reputation. The standard Model U continued selling well, proving that Minneapolis-Moline could build excellent agricultural equipment when they didn't overthink things. World War II temporarily saved Minneapolis-Moline from having to confront the UDLX failure. Like all American manufacturers, they shifted production to support the war effort. Military contracts provided stable income and allowed the company to maintain operations through the war years. Minneapolis-Moline produced tractors for agricultural use. Farming was critical to feeding both the American population and Allied forces. But they also manufactured military equipment. After the war, American agriculture entered a boom period. Mechanization accelerated rapidly. Farmers who had postponed equipment purchases during the Depression and war years finally had money to spend. The entire industry grew explosively. Minneapolis-Moline participated in this growth, but they never regained the innovation leadership they had briefly held in the late 1930s. They became a solid second-tier manufacturer, respected but not dominant. The company continued operations through the 1950s and 1960s, producing reliable tractors that competed on price and performance, but they never attempted anything as audacious as the UDLX again. Other manufacturers were learning the same lesson from their own failures. Allis-Chalmers experimented with alternate fuels. Ford tried radical new designs. Oliver pushed the boundaries of styling. All of them eventually retreated to safe, conventional engineering. The irony is that while the UDLX failed commercially, its core concept was absolutely correct. Everything Minneapolis-Moline had predicted about the future of agricultural equipment came true. It just took 40 years. By the 1970s, enclosed cabs were becoming common on high-horsepower tractors. The cabs were still optional and expensive, but farmers were starting to demand them. The younger generation of operators who had grown up with automobiles and air conditioning weren't willing to bake in the sun or freeze in the snow anymore. Equipment manufacturers responded by offering factory-installed cabs with basic heating and cooling systems. By the 1980s, enclosed cabs were standard equipment on virtually all new tractors above 50 horsepower. These cabs featured air conditioning, heaters, tinted glass, suspension seats, and stereo systems. Farmers could listen to the radio while working, just as the UDLX had offered in 1938. The cabs were insulated for sound reduction. Visibility was improved through larger windows and better positioning. These were sophisticated, comfortable work environments. By the 1990s and 2000s, agricultural cabs had surpassed automotive luxury in many ways. Modern tractors feature climate control systems more sophisticated than most cars. The seats offer air suspension, heating, and cooling. The dashboards contain computer displays showing GPS position, field mapping, yield monitoring, and equipment diagnostics. Operators can connect their smartphones via Bluetooth to stream music or podcasts. Some high-end tractors even have refrigerators and coffee makers built into the cab. Everything the UDLX promised in 1938, comfort, climate control, entertainment, road capability, is now standard on modern agricultural equipment. Minneapolis-Moline was exactly right about what farmers would eventually want. They were just 40 years too early. The question that haunts agricultural historians is simple. What if? What if Minneapolis-Moline had introduced the UDLX in 1975 instead of 1938? What if they had waited until farmers were ready? Would it have succeeded? Would Minneapolis-Moline have established itself as the innovation leader in the industry? We'll never know. By 1975, Minneapolis-Moline no longer existed as an independent company. Financial pressures through the 1960s had weakened the company significantly. In 1963, Minneapolis-Moline was acquired by White Motor Corporation, a truck and bus manufacturer looking to diversify into agricultural equipment. White continued using the Minneapolis-Moline brand for several years, but gradually phased it out. White itself struggled in the agricultural market.
They acquired Oliver Corporation in 1960 and Cockshut Farm Equipment in 1962, attempting to build an agricultural division through consolidation. It didn't work. The combined white agricultural operation never achieved the market position necessary to compete with Deere, International Harvester, or the emerging Japanese manufacturers. In 1985, White was acquired by Allied Products Corporation. In 1991, the agricultural equipment division was sold to Agaco Corporation, where it was absorbed into that company's brand portfolio. Today, Agaco still manufactures tractors, but the Minneapolis-Moline name has gone for decades. The Prairie Gold tractors are collector items now, sought by enthusiasts who remember when Minneapolis-Moline represented bold innovation. The UDLX survivors are even rarer. Of the 125 to 150 units produced, perhaps 30 still exist. Most were worked hard and eventually scrapped when they wore out. Some were converted back to standard agricultural configuration by removing the cab, which actually happened quite often. Farmers who bought UDLX units sometimes decided the cab was more trouble than it was worth and simply cut it off, creating a very expensive standard Model U. The remaining original UDLX tractors are valuable collector pieces, worth anywhere from $75,000 to $150,000, depending on condition and originality. Museums display them as examples of forward-thinking design. Tractor shows feature them prominently. Agricultural historians study them as the first serious attempt to make farming comfortable. And there's the deeper lesson of the UDLX. Timing determines success more than quality. The machine itself was well built, the engineering was sound, the concept was valid, but none of that mattered because the market wasn't ready. Depression-era farmers couldn't afford luxury, and the cultural values of rural America in the 1930s actively resisted the idea that farming should be comfortable. Compare this to the Edsel, Ford's famous failure from 1958. The Edsel was introduced at the wrong time, a large, expensive car, launched just as Americans were becoming interested in smaller, more economical vehicles. The UDLX was introduced at the wrong time, a luxury tractor launched when farmers could barely afford basic equipment. Both were well-engineered machines that failed because they misread the market completely. The difference is that the Edsel represented excess and miscalculation, while the UDLX represented vision that arrived too soon. The Edsel remains a symbol of corporate hubris. The UDLX has become a symbol of prophecy unheeded. Ford never made anything like the Edsel again, and that was probably wise. Minneapolis-Moline never built anything like the UDLX again, and that was tragic. Because here's what Minneapolis-Moline proved with the UDLX. They understood where agriculture was heading better than anyone else in the industry. They recognized that agriculture would modernize, that comfort would matter, that younger farmers would demand better working conditions. They were right about all of it. They just couldn't wait for the world to catch up. The agricultural industry learned the wrong lesson from the UDLX failure. They learned to be cautious, to avoid risk, to wait for customers to demand innovation rather than leading with it. That conservative approach served them well financially. It's hard to lose money when you only build what people already want. But it also meant that agricultural innovation slowed to a crawl through the 1940s and 1950s. Imagine if Minneapolis-Moline had succeeded with the UDLX. Imagine if farmers had embraced it despite the cost. The entire industry would have accelerated toward enclosed cabs, climate control, and operator comfort decades earlier. Farmers in the 1950s could have been working in conditions that didn't become standard until the 1990s. That's not speculation, that's what the UDLX demonstrated was possible. Instead, farmers spent another 40 years enduring heat, cold, dust, and discomfort unnecessarily. They suffered because Minneapolis-Moline failed to convince them that suffering was optional. And Minneapolis-Moline failed because they forgot the fundamental rule of sales. People don't buy what they need. They buy what they believe they need. And in 1938, farmers believed they needed toughness, not comfort.
The technical sophistication of the UDLX deserves deeper examination because the engineering challenges Minneapolis-Moline faced and mostly solved were substantial. Building an enclosed cab tractor in 1938 wasn't simply a matter of welding some sheet metal together and calling it done. Every system required careful thought and innovative solutions to problems that had never been addressed before in agricultural equipment. Start with the cab structure itself. Minneapolis-Moline engineers had to design something strong enough to protect the operator in case of rollover, though rollover protection wasn't formally required by law at the time. But the frame couldn't flex significantly, which would cause the doors to bind and the windows to crack. Yet it also couldn't be so rigid that it transmitted every bump and vibration directly to the operator. The solution was a semi-stressed cab design. The steel panels contributed to structural strength, but the primary loads were carried by a tubular framework welded to the main tractor frame. This framework extended upward from reinforced mounting points behind the transmission housing and ahead of the front axle. Cross members tied everything together, creating a cage structure similar to what would later be called ROPS, rollover protective structure, though that terminology didn't exist yet. The panels were stamped from 18-gauge steel, which provided adequate strength without excessive weight. The door was particularly clever. It used automotive-style hinges mounted externally on the forward edge with a rotating latch mechanism on the rear edge. The door could be opened wide and secured in the open position using a sliding pin that engaged a bracket on the cab side. This allowed operators to work with the door open during mild weather while keeping it secured so it wouldn't swing unexpectedly on slopes. The windows were flat glass, which was easier to manufacture and replace than curved automotive glass. The windshield was actually two separate pieces with a vertical center divider, a design that reduced stress and made replacement cheaper if the glass broke. The side windows were true roll-up designs using a crank mechanism salvaged from automotive parts bins. The rear window was fixed, but could slide open horizontally for ventilation. Sealing the cab was a significant challenge. Agricultural equipment operates in incredibly dusty conditions. A poorly sealed cab would simply fill with dust, defeating the entire purpose. Minneapolis-Moline used rubber gaskets around all doors and windows, but they also had to address the floor. The cab floor wasn't a solid panel. It couldn't be, because the operator needed access to foot pedals and the gear shift lever, which were mounted below on the main tractor frame. The engineering solution was a complex arrangement of rubber boots and flexible seals around every opening. The clutch pedal, brake pedals, and throttle all passed through rubber boots that flexed with pedal movement while maintaining a seal. The gear shift lever came up through a rubber bellows that sealed around the stick while allowing it to move freely. These seals were never perfect. All UDLX cabs accumulated some dust, but they were remarkably effective given the technology available in 1938. Ventilation was achieved through adjustable louvers in the side panels positioned to catch fresh air while minimizing dust intrusion. The louvers could be opened or closed depending on conditions. Additionally, the rear sliding window provided ventilation during hot weather. But ventilation alone wasn't enough during summer heat, which is why the UDLX featured retractable canvas curtains that could be rolled up to open the sides of the cab entirely for summer field work. The heating system was genuinely sophisticated. It tapped into the engine coolant system, routing hot coolant through a small radiator core mounted under the dashboard. A manually controlled valve regulated coolant flow. A fan, powered by the tractor's electrical system, blew air across the hot radiator core, directing warm air into the cab through adjustable vents. This was the exact same principle used in automotive heaters, but implementing it on a tractor created unique problems. Agricultural engines run at varying speeds depending on the work being performed. At low idle, coolant flow was minimal and the heater produced little heat. At high RPM under load, the coolant was extremely hot, and the heater could make the cab uncomfortable. Minneapolis-Moline addressed this by installing a thermostatically controlled bypass valve that diverted excess coolant away from the heater core when temperatures exceeded a set point. The electrical system was upgraded significantly compared to standard Model U tractors. The UDLX used a larger generator, producing 35 amperes instead of the typical 20 amperes, to power the additional electrical loads. Those loads included the heater fan, radio, dashboard lights, and improved headlamps. The radio was a standard automotive AM unit, modified slightly for tractor installation. It received power from the tractor's 6-volt electrical system, which was standard at the time. The antenna was a simple rod mounted externally on the cab roof. Reception quality varied dramatically depending on location. Remember, this was 1938, and AM radio transmission was less ubiquitous than it would become later. But in areas with strong local stations, the radio worked surprisingly well.
Instrumentation was comprehensive. The speedometer was cable-driven from the transmission, just like automotive speedometers. The tachometer was mechanically driven from the engine, showing operator RPM. The other gauges, oil pressure, water temperature, ammeter, were electrically operated. This meant the operator had complete information about machine status at all times, which was valuable for preventing damage during extended highway travel. The lighting system was another area where Minneapolis-Moline went beyond agricultural standards. The UDLX featured sealed beam headlamps, the same technology used on automobiles instead of the primitive oil or acetylene lamps that many tractors still used. The rear of the cab had proper tail lamps with brake lights that illuminated when the operator pressed the brake pedal. This made highway travel significantly safer, especially at night. The brake system itself was upgraded to automotive standards. Most tractors of the period had brakes only on the rear wheels, operated by separate foot pedals that allowed the operator to brake individual wheels for turning. This worked adequately for field work, but was inadequate for highway speeds. The UDLX featured a unified brake system with brakes on all 4 wheels. The rear brakes were mechanically operated through conventional linkages from foot pedals. The front brakes were also mechanical, operated through a linkage system from the same foot pedals. The brakes could still be operated independently for turning. There were 2 pedals, but when locked together with a sliding pin, they functioned as a unified braking system similar to automotive brakes. The brake drums were larger than standard agricultural drums, and the linings were organic material similar to automotive brake linings, rather than the simple cast iron on cast iron brakes common on basic tractors. This provided significantly better stopping power and heat dissipation during extended highway use. The transmission was the standard Minneapolis-Moline 5-speed unit used in Model U tractors, but the UDLX was typically sold with optional high-speed gearing. This replaced the normal final drive ratio with a higher ratio that allowed greater road speeds. The trade-off was reduced pulling power in the field, but most UDLX buyers were willing to accept that compromise for better highway performance. The clutch was a heavy-duty dry disc design, similar to truck clutches of the period. It had to handle both the shock loads of field work and the frequent engagement and disengagement of highway driving. Minneapolis-Moline used a dual spring design that provided smooth engagement while maintaining adequate clamping force. The steering system was conventional worm and sector design, which was standard for both tractors and trucks in the 1930s. The steering wheel was positioned more vertically than typical tractor wheels, approximating automotive positioning. This made highway driving more natural, though it was slightly less convenient for field work, where operators often preferred a more horizontal wheel for easier hand positioning during extended straight pulls. The seat mounting was another clever piece of engineering. The operator's seat was mounted on a sliding track that allowed fore and aft adjustment of about 6 inches. This accommodated operators of different heights, which was unusual for agricultural equipment. Most tractors had fixed seating positions that fit nobody particularly well. The seat itself was constructed with automotive-style springs and padding, upholstered in durable vinyl that could handle dirty work clothes without immediate destruction. The passenger seat was simpler, mounted on a hinged frame that folded down when not in use. This provided a flat platform that could accommodate tools or cargo when no passenger was present. When raised, it provided reasonably comfortable seating for a second person, making the UDLX genuinely capable of transporting small families. All of this engineering came at a cost, not just in money, but in complexity. Every additional system was something else that could fail. The Minneapolis-Moline service manual for the UDLX was twice as thick as the manual for the standard Model U. Dealers had to train their mechanics on electrical systems, cooling systems, brake adjustments, and radio repair. Many dealers weren't equipped to handle this level of sophistication, which contributed to service problems and customer dissatisfaction. The complexity also created weight issues. The UDLX weighed approximately 1,000 pounds more than a comparable Model U without a cab. That extra weight affected field performance, increasing fuel consumption and reducing pulling power slightly. The weight distribution was also different. The cab added weight high on the machine, raising the center of gravity and making the tractor slightly less stable on slopes. Despite these challenges, the UDLX was mechanically sound. The tractors that survived have proven to be reliable machines when properly maintained. The core mechanical components, engine, transmission, rear end, were proven Model U parts with excellent durability. The cab-specific systems were less reliable, but that was true of any 1930s automotive equipment. Radios failed, window cranks jammed, heater valves leaked. These were considered normal maintenance issues in the automotive world, and UDLX owners dealt with them the same way. What Minneapolis-Moline achieved with the UDLX was genuinely impressive from an engineering standpoint. They took agricultural machinery and brought it to automotive standards of sophistication while maintaining the durability required for farming. The fact that farmers rejected it doesn't diminish the engineering accomplishment. It simply proves that engineering excellence and market success are entirely separate things.
The UDLX story doesn't end with failure. It ends with transformation, both for the machine and for what it represents in the broader narrative of agricultural innovation. Because while Minneapolis-Moline lost money and market credibility with the comfort tractor, they accomplished something more valuable in the long term. They proved a concept that the entire industry would eventually adopt. Every modern tractor owes something to the UDLX. When John Deere introduced their SoundGuard cab in 1972, they were implementing ideas that Minneapolis-Moline had demonstrated 38 years earlier. When Iron National Harvester added factory cabs to their premium tractors in the 1970s, they were following a path that Minneapolis-Moline had pioneered. The entire agricultural equipment industry eventually reached the conclusion that Minneapolis-Moline had reached in 1938. Farming doesn't have to be uncomfortable. This raises an interesting question about innovation and failure. Was the UDLX actually a failure? Commercially, absolutely. Minneapolis-Moline lost money, produced a tiny quantity, and abandoned the concept within 3 years. By any conventional business metric, the UDLX was a disaster. But innovation isn't always measured in immediate profits. Sometimes innovation is about demonstrating what's possible, even if the market isn't ready. The UDLX proved that enclosed cabs could work on tractors. It proved that farmers could be comfortable without sacrificing productivity. It proved that agricultural equipment could incorporate automotive technology successfully. These weren't trivial achievements. The legacy of the UDLX lives in every climate-controlled cab bouncing across fields today. The operators who sit in air-conditioned comfort, listening to satellite radio, monitoring GPS displays, and drinking cold water from refrigerated coolers, they're living in the world Minneapolis-Moline envisioned in 1938. The technology has evolved tremendously, but the fundamental concept is identical. Farming can be sophisticated, comfortable, and modern. Understanding the UDLX requires understanding the nature of agricultural innovation itself. Farming is inherently conservative because the stakes are existential. A failed crop means financial ruin. Equipment that breaks during harvest can destroy a year's income. This creates tremendous resistance to change. Farmers adopt new technology slowly, carefully, after it's been proven beyond any doubt.
This conservatism isn't ignorance or stubbornness. It's rational risk management. Industrial workers can try new tools without catastrophic consequences. Office workers can experiment with new software without destroying their livelihood. Farmers operate with no margin for error. When your family's survival depends on successfully planting and harvesting crops in a narrow window of good weather, you don't take chances on unproven technology. Minneapolis-Moline understood the technology, but failed to understand the sociology. They built a machine for the future and tried to sell it to people living in the present. That's not a criticism. It's an observation about the inherent difficulty of innovation in conservative markets. The UDLX failure contributed to a decades-long hesitation across the agricultural industry. Other manufacturers watched Minneapolis-Moline lose money and learned to avoid risk. This created a self-reinforcing cycle. Manufacturers wouldn't build innovative products because farmers wouldn't buy them. And farmers wouldn't buy innovative products because manufacturers didn't build them consistently enough to prove value. This cycle was finally broken in the 1970s by a combination of factors. A new generation of farmers came of age, people who had grown up entirely in the automotive era and expected comfort as standard. These younger farmers had never worked behind horses, had never farmed without tractors, and had no romantic attachment to suffering as proof of work ethic. They simply wanted equipment that didn't make them miserable. Simultaneously, tractors were becoming more powerful and more expensive. A 1970s tractor might cost $30,000 or more, equivalent to a house in some rural areas. At that price point, farmers expected sophistication, and manufacturers realized they could differentiate their premium models through comfort features, creating a tiered product line where high-end tractors came with enclosed cabs as factory equipment. The safety movement also contributed. By the 1970s, rollover protection was becoming legally required in many jurisdictions. Once manufacturers had to build protective structures anyway, adding a cab was a relatively small additional cost. This changed the economic calculation completely. The UDLX cab was an expensive luxury in 1938. In 1975, a cab was a minor addition to already required safety equipment. These factors converged to create the market conditions that Minneapolis-Moline had anticipated 40 decades earlier. By 1980, enclosed cabs were common. By 1990, they were standard. By 2000, an open tractor was considered primitive and unsafe. The transformation was complete. Today's agricultural equipment represents the fulfillment of the UDLX vision on a scale that would have amazed Minneapolis-Moline engineers. Modern high-end tractors feature climate control systems with multiple zones, allowing the operator to set different temperatures for the seat, the cab air, and the floor vents. The seats are ergonomically designed with lumbar support, air suspension, and heating. The visibility is improved through strategically positioned mirrors and cameras that eliminate blind spots. The technology has gone far beyond what 1938 engineering could achieve. GPS guidance systems allow tractors to drive themselves along precise paths, reducing operator fatigue. Yield monitors track crop production in real time, providing data that helps farmers optimize their operations. Connectivity allows operators to communicate with advisors, check weather forecasts, and monitor commodity prices without leaving the cab. But strip away the digital sophistication, and you're left with the same core concept. Farming should be comfortable. The operator should be protected from weather. The machine should be pleasant to operate for extended periods. These were revolutionary ideas in 1938. They're standard expectations in 2024. The collector market for UDLX tractors reflects this understanding. Enthusiasts don't collect these machines because they were successful. They collect them because they were visionary. A restored UDLX represents a moment when one company looked at agriculture and saw what it could be, even though the world wasn't ready. Walking around a UDLX today, 86 years after it was built, is a strange experience. Everything feels both archaic and modern simultaneously. The mechanical systems are primitive by today's standards. Manual controls, simple gauges, basic heater, but the overall concept is completely current. You sit in that upholstered seat, look through that windshield, and understand immediately what Minneapolis-Moline was trying to accomplish. The tragedy of the UDLX isn't that it failed commercially. Commercial failures happen constantly in every industry. The tragedy is that it's discouraged innovation precisely when agriculture needed bold thinking. The Depression and war years were brutal for farmers. Equipment that could have made their lives easier was rejected because the culture valued suffering. That's the real lesson of the UDLX. Sometimes people need to be saved from their own resistance to comfort. Minneapolis-Moline took an enormous risk. They invested heavily in developing a product that challenged cultural norms and economic realities. They believed so strongly in their vision that they built 150 units before the market definitively rejected it. That takes courage. Stupid courage, perhaps, but courage nonetheless. The agricultural equipment industry learned wrong lessons from the UDLX failure. They learned to play it safe, to avoid risk, to wait for customer demand rather than leading with innovation. This served them well financially in the short term. You can't lose money on products you never build. But it meant that agricultural progress slowed, precisely when rapid advancement was possible. Imagine an alternate history where the UDLX succeeded, where farmers in 1940 were already working in comfort, where enclosed cabs became standard by 1945, where the agricultural industry led in operator comfort rather than lagging decades behind automotive standards. That world would have been objectively better for the millions of people who spent their lives operating tractors in harsh conditions. Instead, we got the world we have, an industry that eventually reached the right conclusions after decades of unnecessary suffering. Better late than never, perhaps, but the UDLX proved that never late was possible. Minneapolis-Moline showed the way. The industry chose not to follow until economic and generational forces left no alternative. The surviving UDLX tractors are more than just collectible farm equipment. They're monuments to an idea that was right, but poorly timed. They're evidence that vision without timing is just expensive failure. And they're reminders that sometimes the most important innovations are the ones that fail first, proving what's possible even when the world isn't ready. In the end, Minneapolis-Moline didn't build a tractor. They built a prophecy. The fact that nobody believed it at the time doesn't make it any less true. The UDLX was the future. It just arrived 40 years early, wearing prairie gold, paint, and carrying a price tag that Depression-era farmers couldn't possibly justify. That's not failure. That's tragedy. And there's a difference worth remembering.